Alexander Hamilton is one of the most interesting founding fathers in American history. He has helped shape the way our government and economic system works, and the systems that he has created are still being used even today. Most people know what he has created and about his place in history. However, not lots of people know the details and how it came to be. In this documentary, the first half will be exploring his life in great detail, and the second will take a unique angle on how the government and how everyday life in general would be quite different if Alexander Hamilton were never born. Alexander Hamilton was born on January 11th, 1755 or 1757. The exact year is unknown, to Rachel Fawcett and James A. Hamilton. Rachel had been previously married to a Danish-German merchant named Johann Michael Lavion and had one son named Peter Lavion, but left because it was an abusive relationship. She promptly met James Hamilton at St. Kitts. Alexander was born in the town of Charleston on the island of Nevis, which was part of the British West Indies at the time. Alexander Hamilton had one older sibling named James Hamilton Jr., who was born in 1753. They lived on the island until they moved to St. Croix when Hamilton was 10 years old. Shortly after this, Hamilton's father, James, abandoned him, his mother, and brother, because he found out that Rachel was still technically married to Lavion. To make matters worse, Hamilton's mother caught yellow fever and died later that summer, leaving Hamilton and James Jr. both orphans. They eventually went to live with their cousin named Peter Lytton. They lived with him for a while until, once again, tragedy struck the Hamilton brothers when Peter had committed suicide, once again leaving them orphaned. Peter had left his property to his mistress and daughter. In order to make ends meet, the two brothers went their separate ways, with James becoming a carpenter and Alexander apprenticing a merchant named Nicholas Kruger. Kruger recognized the youth's talent to understand mathematics, business, and have immense skills in writing, despite Hamilton never getting an education, except for a short while he spent in a Jewish school at the age of 10. Kruger decided to converse with the town leaders, and eventually the town decided to collectively take up a fund to send Hamilton to the British colonies. In October of 1772, Hamilton boarded a ship and headed for New York. Hamilton was in New York. He managed to get an education and head to King's College, which is now known as Columbia College in New York City. Around this time, rumors began to pop up about a revolution to escape Britain's rule, and before long, it seemed people were starting to pick sides. Some people decided to be loyalists and stick with Britain, and some decided to be pro-revolution and actively support the revolution. Hamilton decided to go pro-revolution and published many writings supporting the revolution in its pre-war state. Even though he was pro-revolution, he did not approve of mobs and crowds tormenting loyalists. It even came to the point where Hamilton once saved his college president, Miles Cooper, a loyalist, from an angry pro-revolution crowd by using his amazing communication skills to talk down the crowd, allowing Cooper time to escape. Eventually, Hamilton and some of his classmates signed up for a New York militia called the Heart of Oaks. He studied military tactics and recruited others from around New York City and managed to get the company membership up to about 60 men. He went on to fight in a number of battles, with some of his most notable being his successful British cannon raid in the Battery of New York City and the Battle of Princeton. His success in the military got the attention of some other military leaders, such as William Alexander and another unknown general, but turned down the offers to be their aides, as he believed he would get more glory on the battlefield. However, he got an offer he felt that he couldn't refuse, being George Washington's aide. He eventually accepted the offer and served with Washington for 4 years. Most of the work Hamilton did was handling letters from Congress, other generals, and state governors. It was in this period of time that Hamilton met some of his most trusted friends, such as John Lorenz and Marquis de Lafayette. It was also around this time that he met his to-be wife, Elizabeth Schuyler, nicknamed Eliza. Hamilton first met Eliza's sister, Angelica Schuyler, but once he met Eliza, they knew they wanted to get married. They were married on December 14th, 1780. Eventually, Hamilton became restless and wanted to continue to fight as he had before in the militia. Washington kept refusing his requests until eventually he granted him command of 3 light infantry divisions for what would be the Battle of Yorktown. He led sieges on British defenses with other American soldiers and French soldiers. The battle lasted a total of 3 weeks, and eventually, Lord Cornwallis surrendered, leaving America a free and independent country, and Hamilton free to pursue his political endeavors. After the war, Hamilton headed back to New York City, where he decided to practice law and eventually became a lawyer. He specialized in British trials that included claims against English men doing unlawful things after the war. Around this time, he also did other impactful things, such as establishing the Bank of New York, one of the oldest still standing banks in America. He also helped to restore King's College into Columbia College, as it had been severely damaged during the Revolutionary War. After working in law for a couple of years, Hamilton looked into more congressional endeavors. He was a leader at the Annapolis Convention, where he showed off a revised version of the Articles of Confederation. Like many others, Hamilton had not been a fan of the original Articles of Confederation and wanted many changes to the document, most of them having to do with making America a more financially independent government. In other words, he wanted the American economic system to not be as controlled by the government as it was then. He had begun to take an interest in a better financial system during the war when Congress didn't fund the Continental Army almost at all. Eventually, his chance came when in 1787 his father-in-law, Philip Schuyler, who was a well-known politician and well-known soldier, nominated him as a delegate at the Constitutional Convention. He was to be one out of 3 New York delegates at the convention, but the other 2 delegates backed out, making him the only delegate from New York. During the Constitutional Convention, he made several proposals early in the convention about an improved financial system and about other parts of the government, including a president and Senate for life policy. He had these suggestions with good intentions, but unfortunately, it backfired on him later in life, making people think that he was actually a monarchist sympathizer. This belief was mainly upheld by another founding father, James Madison. He also had written an entire revised constitution of what he would have liked it to be, but didn't actually present it at the convention. Once the convention was over, Hamilton wasn't content with the current state of the Constitution, but decided to sign it anyways as it was a major improvement compared to the old Articles of Confederation. To show Hamilton's support for the current Constitution, he decided to write a total of 25 essays defending the Constitution to the public. He recruited founding fathers James Madison and John Jay to help him write the essays. However, they didn't just write 25 essays. They wrote over 3 times as many, ending with a grand total of 85 essays. John Jay wrote only 5 of them, James Madison wrote 29, and Hamilton wrote the other 51 essays. These essays were known as the Federalist Papers and were some of the best writings in Hamilton's life, not to mention some of the best writings in American history as a whole. After the Constitutional Convention, Congress had elected George Washington as their president, and the first president of the United States of America. It was around this time that much of the structure of the United States was put into place, including the establishment of a presidential cabinet that Hamilton would soon be in. On September 11, 1789, Washington appointed Hamilton as the first Secretary of the Treasury. He would leave office on December 31, 1795, and over these nearly 5 years, he would do things such as report on public credit, report on the National Bank, establish the U.S. Mint, establish the Revenue Cutter Service, and report on manufacturing and industry. He also helped birth the establishment of a two-party system, with him being the leader of the Federalist Party. The rival party that emerged to rival him were called the Democratic-Republican Party, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. The Democratic-Republican Party wanted a more rural-based economy and lifestyle in America, and wanted to be protected by state militia rather than a national army and navy. They believed that Hamilton was too sympathetic toward the corrupted Britain, which is where his President and Senate for Life policies from the Constitutional Convention came back as supporting evidence against him. The Federalist Party favored ties with Britain, while the Democratic Republicans favored France. Hamilton, along with the other members of Washington's cabinet, were consulted on what to do when France and Britain went to war in 1793, and they decided to stay neutral during the conflict. However, later in 1794, Britain was willing to trade with the United States. Obviously, Hamilton and the other Federalists wanted to make amends with Britain and trade with them. However, the Democratic Republicans saw Britain as a threat and wanted to engage in a trade war. Eventually, Chief Justice John Jay was to negotiate with Britain on the topic, and his instructions were written down in the Jay Treaty, which was largely written by Hamilton himself. This treaty resolved the remaining issues caused by the Revolutionary War and created 10 years of peaceful trading with Britain. In the summer of 1797, it was revealed to the public that Alexander Hamilton had a sex scandal. It was revealed that 6 years ago, in 1791, that Hamilton had had a sex scandal with 23-year-old Maria Reynolds. According to his account, Hamilton had been approached by Reynolds and claimed that her husband, James Reynolds, had abandoned her and she needed funds to return to her relatives. Hamilton personally delivered $30 to her boarding house shortly after. Apparently, Maria had led him to her bedroom, and one thing had led to another. Unfortunately, Maria's husband, James, found out about what was going on and the affair that was taking place. The common thing to do at the time was to challenge in a duel, but James saw a money-making opportunity and also saw how much Hamilton had to lose at the time, but the money was more important to him. In all, James extorted $1,300 out of Hamilton, including an initial $1,000 extortion. In 1792, one of James' associates, Jacob Clingman, relayed information about the affair to 3 politicians, including James Monroe, who confronted Hamilton about it later that year. The confrontation had many documents connected to it, which didn't come up until 1797. Hamilton asked the men about the documents, and everyone confirmed that they didn't have any connections to it anymore, except for James Monroe, who refused to answer. Fearing for his career, Hamilton decided to publicly come out with the news in a 100-page pamphlet, which came to be known as the Reynolds Pamphlet. This information would be devastating to Hamilton's political career, and he would never fully recover from it. During the election of 1800, Hamilton played a key role. The 2 main runners were Thomas Jefferson and his running mate Aaron Burr, and John Adams with his running mate Charles Cotesworth Pinckney. Hamilton wasn't a fan of either candidate, as Jefferson was in the opposite party as him, while Adams and himself had had some hard feelings for each other in the past, mostly due to the fact that they had bad-mouthed each other during the election of 1796. To at least show his support for the Federalist Party, Hamilton wrote a pamphlet called Letter from Alexander Hamilton Concerning the Public Conduct and Character of John Adams, ESQ, President of the United States, and sent it to members of his party. The pamphlet was highly critical on the things that Adams did wrong while in office, but ended with a lukewarm endorsement for him. Soon after, however, the Democratic Republicans got their hands on the document and printed it, which virtually destroyed Adams' election campaign, split the Federalist Party into two, and destroyed Hamilton's reputation even more than it already was. Although Jefferson had virtually beaten Adams, he had received the same amount of votes as his running mate Aaron Burr, meaning the vote went to the House of Representatives to vote on who would be the new United States president. Hamilton encouraged his fellow members to vote for Jefferson. Although he despised Jefferson, he saw him as the lesser of the two evils, stating that Jefferson was not a dangerous man. Jefferson became the new United States president, while Burr blamed one man for his shortcoming, Hamilton. In 1804, after several other defeats in other matters in which Hamilton was also involved in, Burr demanded an apology letter from Hamilton. However, Hamilton didn't apologize because he said that he could not think of a time that he remembered insulting Burr. Eventually, after some back and forth from the two, they decided to settle their differences with a duel. The duel was planned on June 27, 1804, and was planned for July 11, 1804. For Hamilton, the duel created many moral problems for him. For one, he didn't want to apologize to Burr since he truly believed he was being truthful in never insulting him, which is up in the air whether he did or not, so he didn't want to back out of the duel. However, if he shot and killed Burr, it would have put him in a bad public image, and it would also break his religious and family morals. Eventually, he decided in the duel that he would throw away his shot. On the morning of July 11, 1804, Hamilton and Burr, along with their seconds and multiple others, gathered on the west bank of the Hudson River in Weehawken, New Jersey. The two men took their paces and, once instructed, fired. Hamilton had fired above Burr, and Burr had fired into Hamilton's right hip, fatally wounding him. They eventually rowed Hamilton back across the river and managed to get him to Greenwich Village and into the home of Hamilton's friend, William Bayard Jr. Burr's national image from then on would be completely ruined, and he would never return to politics. Hamilton died the following afternoon and was buried in Trinity Church Cemetery, where his grave still stands today. Hamilton's wife and children continued his legacy by publishing a biography and other writings that he had written when he was alive. Hamilton's legacy is very interesting. For one thing, he is on the $10 bill, which is representative of his role in creating a stable United States economic system. He also has multiple statues of him in the United States, the most notable being in front of the U.S. Treasury, in Central Park, and in front of Columbia College. However, the most notable of Hamilton's legacy is the wildly popular musical known as Hamilton, written and performed by Lin-Manuel Miranda. The musical focuses on Hamilton's life and his most notable accomplishments by using hip-hop and rap. The musical was so popular that it actually managed to overturn a national decision to replace Hamilton on the $10 bill with a more important female figure, and instead they decided to replace Andrew Jackson on the $20 bill. Hamilton's legacy is like no other, and his life is extremely interesting. But what if he were never born? The United States would be incredibly different if Alexander Hamilton were never born. For one, the United States would have a very different financial system, as there would not have been an established U.S. mint, reports on a national bank, or reports on public credit. Also, the Democratic Republicans would most likely have been the dominant party during the elections of 1796 and 1800 because there would most likely not have been a Federalist Party since Alexander Hamilton was one of the founding members. Since John Adams was a Federalist candidate, he might not have ever become president. Speaking of the election of 1800, Aaron Burr may have become president instead of Thomas Jefferson, since Hamilton was one of the driving forces of Jefferson's presidency. Although it is very interesting to see what would have happened if Alexander Hamilton were never born, it is hard to exactly pinpoint what would have happened, and if he were never born, someone else was most likely taken the reins to do something like establish the United States economic system. So because of that, let's shift to more specific situations in Hamilton's life and what would have happened if he would have done something different than what he did do. Starting at the beginning of his life, he caught yellow fever around the same time his mother died, but luckily he recovered. If he never recovered from that fever, then he may have been too sick to go to America, or even could have died, which could have led to Hamilton not doing all the things that he would do in his political career. Much of the same stuff that would happen if he would have died of yellow fever would have happened if the town leaders had not noticed his talents and taken up a fund to send him to the colonies. Once he did get to the colonies, he went to New York. This minor detail is incredibly important because if Hamilton would have landed anywhere else in the colonies, then his life onward would have been very different. For one, during the Constitutional Convention, he wouldn't have been a delegate from New York, but rather the place he landed in instead. He also probably wouldn't have married his wife Eliza Schuyler, since she was from New York. Since he wouldn't have married Eliza, his father-in-law wouldn't have been Philip Schuyler, who was the one who recommended Hamilton for the convention in the first place. This might even have gone so far to the point where Hamilton didn't even get into politics and stayed a lawyer, which means that he wouldn't have been able to do all the things he did in his Secretary of the Treasury years. As you can see, this tiny detail in Hamilton's life could have had a huge butterfly effect on the rest of his life. Another thing that could have a huge butterfly effect is if Hamilton never joined the militia during the Revolutionary War. If he wouldn't have joined, he wouldn't have got any attention from different military leaders, including George Washington, which means he might not have been Secretary-Treasury during Washington's presidency. During Hamilton's political years, if he wouldn't have been invited to the Constitutional Convention, there is really one major effect: reception of the public. You see, if Hamilton were never invited to the Constitutional Convention, he might not have been able to see what was in the revised Constitution. In order to get the public on his side for using the new Constitution, Hamilton, Madison, and Jay wrote the Federalist Papers. If Hamilton didn't go to the Constitutional Convention, There was no reason for him to write the Federalist Papers, since he didn't know what he would be defending. Furthermore, he may not have been invited back to other political matters, like being in Washington's cabinet. However, this is unlikely, since Washington and Hamilton's relationship was mostly established during the Revolutionary War. I've already covered what would happen if Hamilton wasn't the Treasury Secretary, so let's skip to something that would be huge if it were handled differently. If Hamilton had just said no to Maria Reynolds, either when she asked him for money or when she told him to come into the bedroom, then it would have saved him tons of pain and suffering that he would experience later in his life. However, on the other side of the coin, we have if James Reynolds would have never found out. If James Reynolds would have not have found out, or even if Hamilton had said no to Maria, Alexander Hamilton might have actually ended up being President of the United States. If Hamilton hadn't indulged in Maria's offer, or if James' associate didn't tell James Monroe, then Hamilton wouldn't have any reason to write the Reynolds pamphlet later on in his life. Since Hamilton had lots of good things going for him at the time, he would have likely at least had at one time have run for president, and maybe even have won the election. This would have a major effect, since obviously, Hamilton would be remembered as a president, rather than just as a founding father, and he might have even established laws that other presidents did not. Next up is if Hamilton had done things differently during the election of 1800. First is if Hamilton didn't write the letter from Alexander Hamilton concerning the public conduct and character of John Adams, ESQ, President of the United States, which, if you remember, is the letter that Hamilton wrote during the election of 1800 that was critical of John Adams, but ended with a lukewarm endorsement, and was mass-printed by the opposing Democratic-Republican Party. If Hamilton didn't write this letter, then John Adams might have become president once again, and Hamilton would have had more credibility later in his life, since he wouldn't have destroyed Adams' election campaign by accident. Another thing that Hamilton could have done differently was if Hamilton had endorsed Burr instead of endorsing Jefferson. If Hamilton had endorsed Burr, then Burr would have most likely become president rather than Jefferson, which would have led to a whole bunch of things being different, like laws that were passed during Jefferson's presidency not coming to fruition. However, the more major thing would be Burr not challenging Hamilton to a duel, meaning Hamilton would not have been shot and killed. This would have led to many different things, mostly more writings that Hamilton would have finished in his life. Finally, we have if Hamilton had decided to shoot Burr in their duel. If Hamilton had decided to shoot Burr during the duel, then Burr would have most likely died, and Hamilton's legacy would forever be tainted. It would probably have been the final straw for his political career to be completely destroyed after what happened with John Adams' election campaign and with his affair. Also, if Hamilton had shot Burr, then lots of things about the present would be different, since he would have been remembered for the bad things he did rather than the good. These things might include not being on the $10 bill, not having as many statues or memorials for him, and the idea of the musical Hamilton might not have come up, since the creators of it might not have wanted to ruin their image by making a musical about somebody remembered as a villain. Either way, however, Hamilton would still be remembered. Now, finally, our documentary comes to a close. Hopefully, this documentary taught you about the history of one of America's most interesting and necessary founding fathers. I also hope that it taught you about his importance and what would have happened if things were to play out differently. Thank you all for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this documentary about one of the most fascinating people to live in the United States of America, Alexander Hamilton.